There is an airplane sitting in a hangar in Vero Beach, Florida right now that most people in general aviation have never heard of. There is another one in a storage facility in Arizona. There are a few more scattered across Europe, in Germany, in the Czech Republic, in a couple of other countries where aviation regulators and flight school operators and private buyers all looked at the same airplane and came to the same quiet conclusion. And then, after all of that, there were more sitting in the United States, at dealers, at flight schools, at the Piper facility itself, waiting for buyers who never quite showed up in the numbers that the business plan assumed they would. The airplane is the Piper Pilot 100. And if you only know the American side of this story, if you only tracked what happened to it after it launched in the US market, you missed most of the actual story. Because this airplane failed in 6 countries before it failed here, and almost nobody who covered it bothered to lay the whole timeline out in sequence and ask what that sequence actually tells you. That is what we are doing today. Before we get into it, hit subscribe, because this channel goes places on aviation business stories that most aviation media does not get close to. Behind the press releases, behind the airshow announcements, into the actual market dynamics and business decisions that determine which airplanes survive and which ones don't. If you want to understand this industry the way people who actually operate inside it understand it, this is exactly where you want to be, and this particular story is one of the most instructive ones I have covered in a long time. Do not miss what comes next on this. Now, let's build the foundation, because the Piper Pilot 100 story only makes sense if you understand what Piper was trying to solve when they built it. Piper Aircraft, by the middle of the 2010s, was a company with a complicated relationship with its own history. The Vero Beach manufacturer had survived multiple bankruptcies, multiple ownership changes, years of uncertainty about whether it was even going to exist in recognizable form, and it had come through all of that leaner and more focused than it had been during the days when it was building everything from 2-seat trainers up through pressurized twins. By that point, Piper's lineup was anchored almost entirely at the upper end of the general aviation spectrum, the M-Class series, turbine-powered, sophisticated, expensive, and whatever remained of the company's legacy in the entry-level and trainer market was mostly just that, legacy. The Cherokee, the Warrior, the Archer. These were airframes with bloodlines stretching back to the 1960s, certified on type certificates that were decades old, carrying engineering decisions made in a completely different era of aviation manufacturing and a completely different regulatory environment. Piper was still selling them because operators and flight schools had fleets built around them, and the parts ecosystem was mature, and nobody wanted the disruption of switching platforms. But nobody was buying a Piper Warrior in 2018 because it represented some kind of leap forward in training aircraft design. They were buying it because it was a known quantity, because it was safe, because the insurance underwriters understood it, and because the alternative, something genuinely new, carried its own risks that flight school operators were not lining up to take on. Meanwhile, over in Europe, the training aircraft market had been evolving in a direction that Piper was watching carefully and somewhat nervously. Manufacturers like Diamond and Tecnom and Aquila and a handful of others had been building genuinely modern trainer airframes, composite construction or semi-composite, fuel-injected engines, modern avionics as standard rather than retrofit, built to current design standards rather than to type certificates that predated the moon landing. European flight schools were buying these airplanes, and the buyers who were looking at that European market were increasingly asking a question that was becoming impossible to ignore. Why does training in a Cessna 172 or a Piper Warrior, an airframe designed when Lyndon Johnson was still in office, make sense as the foundation of professional pilot training in the 21st century? Piper needed an answer to that question, and the Pilot 100 was supposed to be that answer. The airplane that eventually came to market as the Piper Pilot 100 was not built from scratch inside Piper's Vero Beach design team in some kind of clean sheet engineering exercise. That is the first thing you need to understand about this airplane's DNA, because it matters enormously for why the story unfolded the way it did. Piper's answer to the modern trainer question came through an acquisition. The company that built the core engineering of what became the Pilot 100 was a Czech manufacturer called Tomark Aeronautics, which had developed an airplane called the Viper SD4. The Viper SD4 was a low-wing, 2-seat light sport aircraft built in Slovakia, composite construction, modern design, relatively light and efficient, exactly the kind of forward-looking airframe Piper needed as the basis for a new trainer program. Piper saw in it the skeleton of something that could be modernized, re-engined, re-avionicked, and brought to market as the next-generation entry-level Piper. The Pilot 100 would get a Lycoming engine, a Garmin glass panel, Piper branding and dealer network support, and a price point designed to undercut the Cessna 172 while offering a genuinely more modern airframe. That was the plan, and on paper it was not a crazy plan. It addressed a real gap. It used existing engineering as a foundation, rather than building from zero, which reduced development time and cost. It gave Piper something to sell into the flight school market without abandoning the M-Series business that was actually paying the bills. And it positioned the company to compete in the European training market, where the modernization pressure was strongest and where several of Piper's competitors were already playing. So why are we talking about it in a story about failure? Because the way this airplane actually went to market, and the sequence of markets where it tried to establish itself and couldn't, tells you something important about the gap between aviation business plans and aviation business reality. And that gap opened up first in Europe, well before the American chapters of this story were even written. Let's go through this geographically, because the geography matters. The first serious attempt to establish the Pilot 100 as a viable training aircraft happened in the United Kingdom. This is important to establish clearly, because the UK aviation training market in the period we are talking about, the mid to late 2010s into the early 2020s, was facing enormous structural pressure. Pilot demand projections were optimistic. Airline growth in Europe had been strong. Flight schools were actively looking for modern, cost-effective training aircraft that could be sold to prospective airline cadets on the basis of both quality and economics. The timing should have been favorable. Here is what actually happened. The Pilot 100 arrived into the UK market carrying a price point that made sense if you benchmarked it against a new Cessna 172, but that looked more complicated when you compared it against the used aircraft market that UK flight schools were actually using to fill their fleets, and against the European competitors, particularly Diamond and Tecnam, that had already established deep roots with UK training operators. The airplane was not significantly cheaper than a well-equipped used 172, once you factored in financing, insurance, and the parts and maintenance ecosystem, and it was not clearly superior in capability or economics to the modern European alternatives that operators already knew and trusted. Flight schools in the UK, particularly the larger integrated training programs, were not making purchasing decisions based on brand sentiment. They were running spreadsheets. They were talking to their insurance brokers. They were calling maintenance shops to ask about parts availability and turnaround time. And on those specific practical questions, the Pilot 100, brand new, unfamiliar, with a thin support network in the region and a lineage that traced back through a Slovak light sport aircraft that most UK operators had never dealt with, did not consistently come out ahead. There were also structural factors in the UK market that had nothing to do with the airplane itself, and this is a pattern you will see repeated in every country on this list, which is part of what makes the story so instructive. Aviation training in the UK was already beginning to show signs of the demand contraction that eventually accelerated dramatically when the pandemic hit. The optimistic pilot production forecasts that had been driving fleet expansion at flight schools were starting to bump up against airline hiring patterns that were not expanding as quickly as the projections assumed. Flight schools that had been planning to grow their fleets were beginning to ask harder questions about whether fleet expansion was actually the right move, given where their pipeline of paying students actually stood. When a market is genuinely expanding and operators are confident about demand, they will take a risk on a new and relatively unproven platform if the economics look promising enough. When a market is beginning to feel uncertain, operators get conservative and stick with what they know. The Pilot 100 arrived in the UK at exactly the wrong moment in that cycle, and the sales results showed it. The airplane did not establish meaningful fleet penetration in the UK training market. The conversations happened. The demo flights happened. The signed purchase orders in volume did not happen. Move east to Germany. The German aviation training market has its own specific character, and it is worth understanding that character because it shaped how the Pilot 100 was received in ways that were predictable in hindsight and not adequately anticipated in the planning stages. German flight training, particularly at the commercial and integrated program level, has long been dominated by a handful of established relationships between major training organizations and specific manufacturers. This is not unique to Germany, but it is particularly pronounced there, and it means that a new entrant trying to break into that market is not just competing on specs and price, it is competing against relationships, against established supply chains, against instructors who trained on specific platforms and have built their entire instructional methodology around those platforms, and against maintenance organizations that have deep familiarity with specific airframes and are not eager to add a new one to their approvals list without a compelling reason. The Pilot 100 in Germany ran into exactly this wall. The airplane's composite construction, which was supposed to be a selling point, modern, lighter, better aesthetics, became a point of concern for maintenance organizations that were built around metal airframes. Composite repair requires different training, different tooling, different materials, and a different approval pathway under European Aviation Authority requirements than metal repair does. For a maintenance shop that already had its approvals sorted for the airframes it was currently working on, adding composite repair capability for a new platform represented real cost and real administrative work. When the airplane being asked about is a new market entrant without a guaranteed long-term fleet commitment from an operator, that investment is a very hard sell. Piper's dealer network in Germany at that time was not deep enough to provide the kind of technical support and parts-on-the-shelf availability that large training operators need when they are running an aircraft intensively for training. Training aircraft get used hard. They need parts quickly when something goes on the AOG list, because a grounded training aircraft is a direct, measurable loss of revenue per day. A new operator evaluating a new platform needs confidence that when something breaks on a Tuesday afternoon, the part they need is not coming from Florida on a freight flight that might take a week. That confidence was difficult to establish for the Pilot 100 in Germany in the early phases of market development, and it showed up in the reluctance of German training operators to make the fleet commitment that would have given the program the sales numbers it needed. There were sales conversations in Germany. There were probably operators who got closer than they let on publicly. But the fleet deployments that would have established the Pilot 100 as a genuine presence in the German training market never materialized at the scale the business plan required. Austria and Switzerland, markets that are smaller but often trend-setting for European general aviation and commercial training, told a version of the same story. The alpine flying environment has specific demands that favor certain aircraft characteristics. Training in that environment, where terrain and weather create performance requirements that differ from flat country flying, makes operators particularly conservative about introducing platforms they do not deeply understand. The support network concern that showed up in Germany showed up even more acutely in these smaller markets, where the trained maintenance base is thinner and the risk of an unsupported platform is correspondingly higher. The Pilot 100 generated interest. It did not generate committed fleet orders. In the Czech Republic, the story took on an additional layer of complexity that is genuinely interesting given the airplane's own history. Remember that the Pilot 100's DNA traces back to Tomark Aeronautics in Slovakia, which is Vero Beach's neighbor, geographically speaking, from the perspective of Central European aviation. You might expect that in the Czech Republic and nearby markets, where composite light aircraft manufacturing has a deep industrial base, think of everything that comes out of that region in terms of ultralight and light sport manufacturing. The Pilot 100 would at least be recognized as belonging to a familiar engineering tradition and benefit from some regional affinity for the design approach. It did not play out that way, for a reason that is both simple and somewhat ironic. The Czech training market, precisely because of that strong local composite aircraft manufacturing tradition, had access to domestically sourced or regionally supported modern training aircraft that were backed by manufacturers with deep local presence, local parts availability, and local maintenance expertise. When you are at Czech flight school evaluating a modern composite trainer, your alternatives include aircraft made by companies whose engineers are an hour's drive away, whose parts distributors are in your country, and whose technical support staff speak your language and will come to you when something complicated comes up. The Pilot 100, channeled through Piper's American corporate structure and European distribution, simply could not match that kind of regional support depth, and in a competitive evaluation, it kept losing that comparison. France deserves its own chapter in this story, because the French market interaction with the Pilot 100 was shaped by a regulatory and institutional landscape that makes it genuinely distinctive. French aviation training, particularly at the commercial level, has historically been heavily influenced by large institutional operators, the flight academies that supply airline pipelines, and those institutions have their own procurement processes, their own political and regulatory dynamics, and their own deeply established fleet preferences. Getting into those procurement pipelines as a new platform requires a level of institutional patience and political groundwork that is genuinely different from selling individual airplanes to private operators. Piper's commercial footprint in France was not built for that kind of long-cycle institutional sales process. The distribution and support infrastructure in France was oriented toward the upper end of the general aviation market, the M series, the turbine airplanes, not toward high-volume fleet sales to training institutions. The Pilot 100 needed a completely different go-to-market approach in France than the one Piper's French distribution was designed to execute, and that mismatch in infrastructure to market requirement meant the airplane never got the institutional traction it needed to establish itself. Individual sales happened, fleet commitments did not. So by the time we get to the American market entry of the Pilot 100, the airplane has already been through this entire gauntlet. 6 countries, the same basic pattern repeated in each one with local variations, competitive evaluation, genuine interest from some operators, concerns about support infrastructure, concerns about parts availability, concerns about the depth of the dealer and maintenance network, and ultimately, the volume of committed fleet orders that the business case required simply not materializing. The business was not dead in Europe, but it was not thriving in the way the projections assumed, and that meant the American market entry was carrying the weight of needing to succeed where the international rollout had not delivered. This is a dynamic in aviation business that does not get enough analytical attention, and it is worth slowing down on for a moment before we get to the US chapter, because it fundamentally shapes what you should expect from the American story. When a new aviation product goes to international markets first and fails to gain traction at the level the business plan assumes, it creates compounding financial and organizational pressure on the original program in ways that are not always visible from the outside. The international sales that were projected to fund ongoing development, refinement, and scale-up of the manufacturing and support infrastructure did not materialize at the expected rate. That means the investment required to get the airplane into U.S. certification, into the U.S. dealer network, into the U.S. training market, had to come from a base that was thinner than the original plan assumed. And it means the timeline for getting to profitability was being stretched even before the U.S. chapter started. There is also an organizational attention dynamic that matters here. When a new program has been struggling internationally for a period of time, the internal conversations about resource allocation within the parent organization inevitably shift. The enthusiasm and organizational commitment that surrounds a new program in its early optimistic phase are not unlimited resources. They get stretched by difficulty, by missed targets, by the accumulated weight of markets that did not respond as hoped. By the time the Pilot 100 was being positioned for the U.S. market, it was not riding a wave of international success. It was carrying the narrative baggage of a European rollout that had not gone according to plan, and that baggage shaped both the internal dynamics at Piper and the external perception among dealers and operators who follow aviation industry news closely enough to know the backstory. The U.S. market entry happened against this backdrop, and the American aviation training market in the period the Pilot 100 was trying to establish itself had its own very specific characteristics that were going to make the task harder than the surface-level opportunity suggested. Let's talk about those characteristics, because they are important. The U.S. flight training market, for all its scale, is extraordinarily conservative about training fleet decisions at the institutional level. This might seem counterintuitive, given that America has this reputation for entrepreneurialism and risk appetite, but flight schools, particularly the larger Part 141 programs that are the natural fleet customers for a manufacturer trying to place significant numbers of new training aircraft, are running businesses where their insurance costs, their maintenance costs, and their check ride pass rates are all intimately tied to the specific airframes their students are training on. Switching platforms has real costs that go well beyond the sticker price of the new airplane. Instructor transition training, maintenance authorization and tooling, revised training curriculum, updated insurance programs, new spare parts inventory. All of that gets factored into the actual cost of a fleet change, and when you add it up, the true cost of switching from a known, supported platform to a new one is considerably higher than just the price difference in the aircraft themselves. Cessna, with the 172, has an installed base advantage in the U.S. training market that is genuinely difficult to overstate. The 172 has been the backbone of primary flight training in this country for so long that the entire ecosystem, insurance actuarial tables, maintenance authorization, parts distribution, instructor familiarity, check airman experience, is built around it. When a flight school operates 172s, almost everything they need to support those airplanes is a phone call or a UPS delivery away. The parts ecosystem is mature. The maintenance network is deep. The insurance underwriting is straightforward. because underwriters have decades of claims data on this airframe and know exactly what it costs them to insure. None of that exists for a new platform, and all of it has to be built from zero for any new entrant trying to establish itself as a training fleet option. This is not an impossible challenge. Diamond did it with the DA-20 and the DA-40. Cirrus did it on the owner-pilot side. But both of those programs required years of patient investment in dealer infrastructure, parts distribution, maintenance training, and insurance underwriting relationship building before the sales numbers started reflecting the quality of the product. The question for the Pilot 100 was whether Piper had the runway, financial, organizational, and strategic, to make that patient investment while also carrying a European program that had not delivered the returns that were supposed to fund it. The answer, as it turned out, was no, or at least not fully. The Pilot 100's U.S. market experience followed a pattern that will be familiar from the international story, with some specifically American wrinkles. Interest from flight schools was genuine. Demo flights happened. Conversations with larger training organizations happened at various levels of seriousness. But the fleet commitments that would have given the program the scale it needed to become financially self-sustaining did not arrive at the pace the business plan required. Some of the reasons were the same ones that showed up in Europe. Parts and support availability was a concern for operators running a fleet intensively. Insurance on a new platform without an established actuarial base required conversations with underwriters that added friction compared to known platforms. The Garmin panel was strong, genuinely modern and well integrated, but it was not enough of a differentiation by itself to overcome the institutional inertia around established platforms when the support ecosystem concerns were still unresolved. Some of the reasons were specifically American. The U.S. pilot training pipeline in the period the Pilot 100 was trying to find its feet went through some extraordinary gyrations. The pandemic crushed flight school enrollment in the near term, and while the subsequent recovery was strong, the disruption it caused to fleet planning and capital allocation at flight schools created a moment of maximum conservatism about new platform adoption. When a flight school is trying to survive a period of dramatically reduced revenue and uncertain student volume, the last thing it wants to do is take on the risk and cost of a fleet transition to an unproven new platform. The pandemic timing hit the Pilot 100's U.S. market entry at almost the worst possible moment for the kind of institutional fleet conversations the program needed to have. Then, when the recovery came and flight schools started thinking again about fleet expansion, they faced a supply chain environment that pushed every capital allocation decision toward caution about commitments on new and relatively untested platforms. The parts supply issues that the broader aviation industry was dealing with in the pandemic recovery period made operators even more reluctant to take on a platform with a thin parts ecosystem, because the general parts availability environment was already stressful enough without adding the additional challenge of sourcing components for an airplane that did not have a deep distribution network. The pricing reality also deserves direct attention because it sits at the center of the value proposition problem. The Pilot 100 was priced, when properly equipped with the Garmin avionics and the other features that made it competitive, at a number that made it genuinely difficult to justify over alternatives. A well-equipped Cessna 172, the canonical alternative, was expensive too, and getting more expensive every year, but it came with the entire ecosystem advantage we have been discussing. A used 172 in good condition was available at a fraction of the price of a new Pilot 100 and carried that same ecosystem advantage. And for a flight school making a capital allocation decision with limited access to financing in an uncertain market environment, the case for spending new airplane money on a platform with a thin support ecosystem versus used airplane money on the airplane whose ecosystem was the deepest and most mature in all of aviation was a genuinely difficult one to make, and a lot of flight school operators decided they could not make it work. There is a specific wrinkle in the American story that I want to spend real time on, because it doesn't get enough attention, and it matters for understanding what the Pilot 100 experience tells us about the broader market environment. The U.S. regional airline pipeline pressure on flight schools is enormous, and has been for years. Flight schools are under continuous pressure to produce graduates who are instrument proficient, multi-engine capable, and accumulating hours toward the ATP minimums that modern professional aviation careers require. This pipeline pressure shapes purchasing decisions in ways that are not always obvious from the outside. When a flight school is optimizing for producing airline-ready pilots efficiently, The training aircraft they choose is not just a training aircraft. It is a piece of the pathway toward a very specific professional outcome that their students are paying significant sums of money to achieve. The aircraft needs to be thoroughly understood by instructors, thoroughly supported by maintenance, and thoroughly accepted by insurance underwriters in the context of an intensive training program. New platforms, however capable on their engineering merits, carry risk in that context that established platforms do not. This is particularly relevant for the Pilot 100 because its marketing positioned it as a genuinely modern alternative to the 172 in the professional training pipeline, not just as a niche or boutique option. That is an ambitious positioning. Succeeding in it would have required convincing flight schools that the risk of adopting a new platform was worth taking, given the potential benefits in operating economics and modernization. The benefits were real. But the risk was also real, and in a training pipeline where the consequences of platform problems, grounded aircraft, delayed training, increased insurance costs, are measured directly in the career timelines of students paying six-figure sums to get to the regional flight deck, operators were not willing to absorb that risk without a level of support ecosystem maturity that the Pilot 100 simply had not yet achieved. Let me now talk about what the combined international and domestic failure trajectory of the Pilot 100 actually tells us about aviation product strategy, because this is where the story stops being about one specific airplane and starts being about something much larger and more important for understanding this industry. The aviation manufacturing and market development world is full of people who are extraordinarily good at engineering airplanes, and genuinely not as sophisticated about what it actually takes to establish a new platform in a market that has deep institutional conservatism, established competitors with massive ecosystem advantages, and buyers who are making capital allocation decisions under significant financial and operational constraints. This is not a criticism of the people who built the Pilot 100. The engineering is not the problem. The airplane flies well by all accounts. The panel is modern. The performance numbers are reasonable. The people who designed and built it did their job. The failure is not in the airplane. The failure is in the mismatch between the go-to-market strategy and the actual requirements of building a new platform into an institutionally conservative market. And that mismatch is not unique to Piper or to the Pilot 100. It shows up again and again in general aviation history, across different manufacturers in different eras. Because the structural challenges of displacing an established platform in a conservative market are genuinely hard to solve and are genuinely underestimated again and again by teams that are focused primarily on the product rather than the ecosystem. Here is the core insight that the Pilot 100's six-country international trajectory makes visible if you look at it as a sequence rather than as isolated national stories. This airplane was not rejected because it was bad. It was rejected because it was new and thin on ecosystem in markets that needed deep ecosystem support, and because it arrived at unfavorable moments in each market's demand cycle, and because the competitive alternatives, both established platforms and regionally supported modern alternatives, had ecosystem advantages that a new entrant with limited distribution depth and a thin parts network could not overcome through engineering quality alone. That same pattern, played out 6 times in 6 different countries before the U.S. chapter, was not a series of independent failures. It was a systematic demonstration of the same underlying challenge. The markets were not wrong. The airplane was not wrong. The go-to-market strategy for a conservative institutional market was not calibrated to the actual requirements of the task, and the results in each country were a predictable consequence of that mismatch. The fact that nobody appears to have looked at the international trajectory in sequence and drawn the obvious conclusion before the U.S. market entry is itself a story. In a properly functioning product development and market feedback loop, 6 consecutive markets where the airplane fails to achieve fleet penetration at the scale the business plan assumes would trigger a fundamental reassessment of the go-to-market strategy, the support infrastructure, the dealer network depth, the parts distribution model, the pricing, the target customer definition, before the next major market launch. That reassessment either did not happen at a sufficient scale or did not produce sufficient changes in the approach, because the U.S. market entry followed the same structural pattern and encountered the same structural challenges. Now let's talk about what happened after. Because when a program like this runs into the wall it ran into, the question becomes what happens to the aircraft that were built, the dealers that invested in representing the brand, the flight schools that got far enough in the conversation to have real expectations about availability and support, and the customers who did buy these airplanes and are now living with the consequences of owning a platform whose manufacturer support is uncertain. The Pilot 100 program did not simply pivot cleanly to a new strategy. The trajectory of the program has been characterized by a kind of organizational uncertainty that is familiar to anyone who has followed troubled aviation product launches over the years. There have been periods of what appears to be renewed commitment, announcements about updated configurations, dealer communications about ongoing support, and other signals designed to reassure the market that the program is continuing. There have also been periods of silence and apparent organizational pulling back that send the opposite message. The result is a market perception that oscillates between cautious hope and quiet skepticism in ways that do not help any of the parties involved. For the operators and owners who did buy Pilot 100 aircraft, this uncertainty is not abstract. It shows up in specific, practical questions that affect their day-to-day operations and their long-term financial exposure. What is the parts availability situation going to look like in 3 years? In 5 years? If the program is effectively discontinued or significantly wound down, what happens to the type certificate, and who is responsible for supporting the airplanes that are already out there? What does ownership of a platform with uncertain manufacturer backing do to resale value, and therefore to the financial case for having bought new, rather than buying a used 172 with a deep and mature support ecosystem? These are not hypothetical concerns. They are the same concerns that showed up in the market research and the dealer conversations before the sales that didn't happen, and they are the most important questions facing the buyers who did commit. The aviation industry has examples of programs where manufacturer withdrawal from a platform created genuine long-term support problems for owners, and it has examples of programs where type certificate holders and parts distributors stepped in to maintain support even after the original manufacturer moved on. Which version of that story plays out for the Pilot 100 is genuinely uncertain, and that uncertainty is itself a market dynamic with measurable consequences. The dealer network experience deserves direct attention too, because dealers are the middle layer in this story, and their position is genuinely difficult. A dealer who invested in the training, the facility preparation, the inventory commitments, and the marketing to represent the Pilot 100 made those investments based on projections about the program that did not materialize. The flight schools that were going to buy fleets of these airplanes mostly did not. The private buyers who were going to be attracted by the modern panel and the Piper name mostly chose to do something else with their money. The dealer is left with a product line that has not delivered the revenue that justified the investment, a relationship with a manufacturer whose own commitment to the program is uncertain, and a customer base that has questions about long-term support the dealer cannot always answer with confidence. This dynamic, the manufacturer making product decisions that leave dealers in a difficult position, is not unique to Piper or to this program. It is a recurring pattern in general aviation that reflects the genuine difficulty of managing a distribution channel through a challenging product launch, and it has real consequences for the health of the dealer network that the manufacturer depends on for every product it sells, not just the one that is struggling. A dealer who gets burned on a product commitment is a dealer who is more cautious about the next one, and that caution extends to the entire manufacturer relationship, even when the next product is genuinely well-positioned. Let me now zoom out to the broader market lesson, because this is where the Pilot 100 story connects to everything happening in general aviation right now, and why understanding this specific story matters for thinking about the industry going forward. General aviation has been dealing with the modernization challenge. How do you replace aging platforms with genuinely modern alternatives when the institutional ecosystem around existing platforms is so deep and so mature, for decades, and it has not solved it cleanly? The Cessna 172 is still the dominant primary trainer in the United States because no alternative has successfully overcome the combination of ecosystem depth, insurance familiarity, parts availability, and institutional inertia that surrounds it. That is not because no one has tried. It is because the task is genuinely hard in ways that the engineering quality of the Challenger does not fully address. The Pilot 100 is the most recent and most internationally visible example of this challenge, but it sits on a long list of programs that tried to displace or significantly compete with established platforms in the primary training market, and found the going much harder than the initial engineering and commercial logic suggested it should be. What makes the Pilot 100 story particularly instructive is the international dimension. Most of the programs that ran into this challenge did so primarily in the U.S. market, where the Cessna ecosystem advantage is most pronounced and most deeply entrenched. The Pilot 100 ran into a version of the same challenge in 6 European markets, where the competitive dynamics and institutional structures are different from the US, but where the same fundamental problem, a new entrant with thin ecosystem support trying to crack institutionally conservative fleet buyers in a market with established alternatives, produced the same essential result. That consistency across 6 different national market contexts is the most important data point in the entire story. It suggests that the problem the Pilot 100 encountered was not primarily a function of local market conditions, national regulatory quirks, or specific competitive situations in individual countries. It was a function of the underlying challenge of establishing a new platform in a conservative institutional market with thin support infrastructure, and that challenge travels across borders in ways that market-specific tactical adjustments cannot overcome. For anyone in the aviation business who is thinking about how to introduce a new training platform, not just today but in the coming years, as the industry genuinely needs to modernize its training fleet and deal with the avgas transition and the pilot pipeline pressure and all the other structural challenges pressing on it, the Pilot 100 story is required reading. Not because the airplane failed due to some unique or avoidable mistake, but because the pattern of how it failed is so consistent and so clearly documented across so many different contexts that it defines the actual dimensions of the problem that any new entrant needs to solve before the first airplane is delivered. The solution is not just a better airplane. The solution is not just a lower price. The solution is not just a better panel or a more compelling demo flight. The solution is a go-to-market approach that builds ecosystem depth, parts availability, maintenance network, insurance actuarial data, trained maintenance technicians, certified instructors with genuine type familiarity, faster than market conservatism can reject the new entrant on ecosystem grounds. That is a genuinely hard problem, and it requires capital, patience, and organizational commitment at a level that is difficult to sustain through a string of markets that are not delivering the returns the business plan assumed. Which brings us to what this means for you if you are watching this as someone who cares about general aviation, as a pilot, as a student, as a flight school operator, as a dealer, as someone who just wants to understand where this industry is headed and why it makes the decisions it makes. The pilot training infrastructure that produces general aviation pilots and professional airline pilots in this country and around the world is deeply dependent on platforms that are increasingly old. The 172 is a magnificent airplane, but it is also an artifact of an engineering era that ended before most of the people flying it were born. The industry needs modern training platforms. The demand is real. The case for updating the fleet is not in question. What the Pilot 100 story demonstrates clearly is that having a case that makes sense does not automatically translate into a market transition, and that the gap between having a genuinely good answer to the modernization question and successfully deploying that answer in the market is wide enough to swallow programs that were well-intentioned and technically capable. For flight school operators who are thinking about fleet decisions right now, the Pilot 100 story is a reminder of why the questions about parts availability, support network depth, insurance actuarial status, and manufacturer program stability matter as much as the airplane's performance numbers and the panel's capability. The performance numbers are the price of admission. The ecosystem questions are what determine whether operating the airplane in an intensive training environment is actually going to work, and they need to be asked with genuine rigor before a fleet commitment is made. For dealers who are being asked to represent new platforms with ambitious market entry claims and thin initial support infrastructure, the story is a reminder that the cost of an unsuccessful product commitment extends well beyond the direct financial loss on the inventory. It shapes customer relationships, manufacturer trust, and the dealer's own risk appetite for subsequent new platform investments in ways that have long tails. And for anyone who is watching the aviation industry's modernization challenge and wondering why it takes so long, why obviously better solutions struggle to displace obviously aging alternatives, why the 172 is still the dominant trainer decades after its design was finalized, the Pilot 100 story is part of your answer. The conservative markets are not wrong to be conservative. They are responding rationally to real risks that come with adopting new platforms that have not yet built the ecosystem depth to make those risks manageable. Overcoming that conservatism requires more than engineering quality. It requires ecosystem investment, patient capital, and a go-to-market strategy that is calibrated to the actual requirements of building a new platform into a market that has very legitimate reasons for being cautious about new platforms. That is not an impossible task. But it is a harder task than most of the business plans for new aviation programs fully account for, and the history of the Pilot 100 across 7 countries is one of the clearest demonstrations of why that gap between business plan and market reality matters so much. One more dimension worth naming before we close, because it connects this story to a conversation that the aviation industry is going to be having for a long time. The pilot shortage is real. The training pipeline pressure is real. The avgas transition is real. The average age of general aviation aircraft is real. All of those pressures point in the direction of needing genuinely new training platforms built on modern engineering to replace an aging fleet. That demand will eventually produce new platforms that succeed, because the need is genuine and durable enough to sustain the patient investment that market entry in this sector requires. But the timeline on which that happens is going to be shaped heavily by how the industry processes the lessons from programs like the Pilot 100. If the lesson taken is simply that the airplane was not good enough or not cheap enough, the next programs will optimize for being better and cheaper without solving the ecosystem problem, and they will run into the same wall in the same sequence. If the lesson taken is that ecosystem investment, the unsexy, expensive, slow return work of building parts networks and maintenance training and insurance relationships and dealer technical depth, is the actual prerequisite for market penetration in this sector, then the programs that come next will be designed around solving that problem from day one, rather than assuming that a good airplane will pull the ecosystem along in its wake. The Pilot 100 failed in 6 countries before it failed in the United States. Nobody tracked the timeline in sequence, but the timeline is the story, and the story tells you exactly what the real problem was and exactly what the actual solution will need to address. Not just for the next training aircraft program, but for every ambitious new platform launch in a market that has every reason to be conservative and is going to stay conservative until the ecosystem reasons for conservatism are actually addressed. That is the real lesson buried in this airplane's international trajectory, and it is why this story deserves to be told in full, in sequence, and with the geographic breadth that makes the pattern unmistakable. Let me know in the comments what you think about the Training Fleet Modernization Challenge and whether you've seen this same ecosystem problem show up in other aviation product launches you've followed. I want to hear particularly from flight school operators and dealers who have been in these conversations, because the ground-level perspective on why these fleet decisions go the way they go is more valuable than anything I can reconstruct from the outside. And if this kind of deep analysis of aviation business dynamics is what you're here for, hit subscribe, because there is a lot more coming on, where new platform launches succeed and fail in this industry, and what the patterns tell us about where general aviation is actually headed. Fly safe, and I will see you in the pattern.